All right, welcome back to another episode of The Ride. It's Coach Q, and I hope you're enjoying an awesome holiday break with your families. I'm currently trying to recover from my own family vacation, but I wanted to get you this episode with Coach Andy Copeland. Now, Coach Copeland most recently stepped down from his head coaching position with the PLL WaterDogs and is seen as a true program builder in our sport. Andy became one of the youngest head coaches in Division I history when he took over Marist at just 22 years of age. He went on to serve as an assistant at Maryland and later spent more than a decade leading Fairfield University to its most successful seasons. So the main topics of conversation today included Coach Copeland's offensive principles, how he gets the likes of Michael Sowers and other top PLL talents to mix into a cohesive offense, and how he took Fairfield University for more than a decade at the mid-major level and competing with the Blue Bloods year after year, oftentimes beating some of the top-ranked teams in the nation. I was really fascinated by. So we had a really great conversation. As always, hopefully you find some value in it and enjoy the ride. All right, Coach Copeland, welcome to the show. It's an honor actually talking with you here today. I'm glad you took some time to meet and have this conversation. How you doing?
We're doing great. Thanks for having me. This will be fun.
We were just talking about what you guys were doing up in Greenwich, Connecticut. Do you ever miss the college grind? It's post-fall now, but we're going to get into the season. I'm just interested, man. Are you missing the college grind at any point, or you're happy where you're at?
I'm really happy where I'm at. And that's not to say that I don't miss certain aspects of the college game. I mean, obviously, I still have a ton of friends that are in the college game. And I actually just talked to Kevin Warren, who's the head coach of Georgetown, just last night. He's one of my dear friends. So keep some tabs on a lot of the programs that I obviously have ties to. But to be honest with you, I've been at Greenwich Country Day for 7 years now and kind of got out right before COVID hit and, you know, the transfer portal in the 5th year and the NIL stuff. And there's a lot of that stuff that I feel pretty blessed to have missed, frankly.
Yeah, the NIL stuff is wild, man. Just a complete paradigm shift. The football, obviously, football, basketball, those guys have to deal with it a little bit more, but it's an interesting point you're making about just how that coaching style has had to change in like the past 3 to 4 years with NIL.
Without question. I mean, you always have to have some flexibility and be nimble because things year over year are always shifting to a certain degree, but that feels, it feels pretty drastic. And, certainly kind of for the mid majors, I think it's hard to keep up with some of the big boys. But every school has its pros and cons. But 16 years in the Division I world, I really loved it. Ton of growth, ton of great people, 3 awesome institutions that I kind of worked at. And, obviously I played at Bucknell. That's my alma mater. So I'm a proud Bucknell Bison and certainly supportive of their program as well.
How they doing? How's Bucknell doing?
Frankie Fed's the best. He's the head coach there currently. He was actually Sid Jamison's assistant. He recruited me. We're going back kind of circa 1999 is when I graduated Pittsford Mendon High School in upstate. But one of the things I really appreciate about Bucknell is they've only had two head coaches in their tenure. It was Sid Jamison, transitioned after like a 35-year career to Frank Federaca, who was his longtime assistant. So there's been a lot of continuity around that program, which, I don't want to speak for all the alums, but I think it certainly is something that we appreciate, feel a part of.
Yeah. Coach, speaking of the programs you've been at, we're going to kind of go reverse chronological here, most recent first, and then work your way all the way back to when you were one of the youngest head coaches at Marist. So it's going to be a great conversation, but just jumping off point here, in my pre-episode research, one of the first things that comes up was a video of Mikey Sowers talking about you kind of stepping down with the WaterDogs, but the time that he had with you. It was a very glowing response when they asked Mikey to talk about you. And he talked about your relatable coaching style and kind of how you were able to meld that locker room really well. And I guess my first question is is that something you feel like you were born with, and how much of that is development versus, nature and just who you are?
Well, first of all, I miss Michael. He's the absolute best. That's one of the things I miss from the PLL was just honestly talking to Michael pretty much on the daily. That dude he's awesome as a lacrosse player, certainly, but people don't maybe fully know just how awesome of a person he is. So
what things would you talk about with him daily?
I mean, he's so passionate about lacrosse and about winning and about, his career and, whatever it took to try to win some ball games for the WaterDogs. And obviously now that they're out of Philly, he's a Philly boy. So he's a very prideful Philly boy, but just everything and anything, really lacrosse related and life related. And I think back to your question, I think maybe a combination of both. I think, I was fortunate to be born with some pretty good, I guess, people instincts and kind of ability to connect with people of all ages. And I think that certainly is one of the qualities that, has been helpful throughout my coaching career. And then the other part of it too is just having some humility and being a good listener and asking questions and really getting to know people outside of just their lacrosse careers. And I've certainly experienced this now that I'm in the high school world, that I think once kids know that you genuinely care about them as people, I think that allows you to then coach them maybe a little bit harder. And that's when you can get more out of them. And you can really just get them to hopefully reach their potential, which is kind of the goal for all of us coaches. So I hope that answers the question, but yeah, I think some of it was, kind of blessed with some pretty decent instincts with some of this stuff. And then the other part of it, yeah, is just, it's kind of the whole person and all
Yeah.
development, not just coaching.
Yeah, I'm interested in that development. I mean, again, we go back to Marist, and you took over the program as one of the youngest coaches, and you went on to have a very successful run at Fairfield, WaterDogs. How in that kind of time frame did you develop some of these traits? Again, I love the answer that it is both, but how did you go about developing some of those kind of interpersonal relationships, or the idea that like that this was my philosophy and how I want to treat people and be this coach?
I think one of the best things that happened to me professionally was being named head coach at Marist at the age of 22. I was frankly not ready to be a Division I head coach. Kind of a unique set of circumstances took place. And I was kind of the interim head coach a year after I graduated from Bucknell, and then I was named the full-time head coach the year thereafter. But it was a situation where it was like you get thrown right into the deep end, and it's sink or swim. Like figure it out. There's no way around this. You can lean into some of your coaching mentors, where at the time I didn't really have very many, just because I was so green. So you just kind of have to rely on your natural instincts, and you have to be personable to the guys that you were coaching. But you also, I was super competitive and probably, as a young 22-year-old, probably like emotional to a fault based off of how the outcome of the previous game went. But, I think guys knew that it was important to try to create like a winning culture and winning habits. And I think when you do that just on the daily, hopefully that process lends itself into some more desirable results. And then confidence goes a long way, right? Guys start feeling that they can do this. You kind of carry that momentum and see where it takes you. But it was a lot of fun. Kind of won the regular season, I think, my first year. And then we were the 1 seed in the MAC tournament, and we got knocked off by Timmy Mack and his Manhattan boys. And then the next year we were actually the 4 seed, kind of like limped our way in, but we ended up beating the 1 seed and the 2 seed to advance to the first round of the NCAA tournament, where we played that Hopkins team in 2005 that was littered with talent. And they beat us up pretty good, but that was also their, undefeated season. They won a national championship that year. So to be able to say that you made it to the tournament and lost the defending champs, that was a small win. And then from there, kind of got to know Dave Cottle, who was the head coach of Maryland, and he was nice enough to kind of recruit me down to College Park, and that really kind of put me on a totally different professional path.
Yeah, the chronological order piece, or I guess reverse chronological, is going to have to be flipped, because I want to talk about Marist now. You're coming in at 22. I guess a couple lightning questions here. One, what would you tell your 22-year-old self? Like, what's the one thing you would tell your 22-year-old self if you could now, and just reach into his ear as he took the job?
Boy, what a great question. Maybe just like slow down. I think at 22, you want everything to happen yesterday. And that's not how things go. I think I really have become far more appreciative of the process that goes into winning a lacrosse game, winning a championship, having a successful season. I probably didn't have that patience nor level-headedness. When I was 22, it was very, kind of results focused, results oriented. And, while we produced some results, I think that probably was a little bit of a flaw just in terms of my approach.
Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I talked with Coach Stagnita like 2 weeks ago, I believe, and he was talking about taking the Washington Lee job when he was very young as well. So it's interesting that we're having that same discussion. He said, I came in full of piss and vinegar, and I thought that was a great way to put it. Why do you feel like that kind of style of being very maybe intense or results focused is tough in the long run? Does that just kind of wear out on the guys, or what's that reason that you would tell your 22-year-old self, like, hey, just slow down a little bit?
Yeah, I think exactly what you just said is I don't know that that's like a sustainable formula. I think it becomes too emotional, and then your highs are super high and your lows are super low, and you kind of end up treating a single lacrosse game like it's life or death, and that's not healthy. I think it's let's be the best version of ourselves. Let's learn how to be great teammates. Let's learn how to be great competitors. Let's learn how to prepare the right way to kind of follow a game plan, and hopefully you make more positive plays than your opponent. But regardless of the result, the sun's going to come up tomorrow and we keep moving.
Yeah. Any other quick tidbits on your time at Marist? Just it seems like a long time ago, but I'm sure it feels like a little bit of just yesterday. So, any other times or things you learned from having that job before we move on?
It was just an awesome locker room. They were fun guys. I still keep in touch with a number of them. A couple of them are now kind of in the coaching ranks themselves. So that's kind of a nice, connection to maintain. And then the AD and I guess the president, he's no longer the president there, but I really appreciate them giving a young 22-year-old Andy Copeland a chance back then. So I also felt like a real responsibility to try to deliver for them. But yeah, my takeaway is the people there were awesome.
Yeah. I guess last question I have here is the age gap is probably the smallest it ever could be when you're talking about a head coach. But I guess speaking to the assistant coaches that are oftentimes, similar in age to some of the players they might even be coaching these days, how did you manage that age gap and the respect factor of that didn't just come naturally because you're 20 years older than somebody? How did you manage kind of that portion where you're so close in age to these guys?
Yeah, that's a great question too. You really had to, have some discipline and some self-control and make sure not to blur those lines. Cause I literally was a year older than them, kind of walking throughout campus. Like I had you not known me as Andy Copeland, the head coach at Marist College, like I probably looked like a student. So just making sure that you didn't blur those lines, that there was, professionalism in terms of what we were trying to do. But I also think there was relatability because of the closeness in age. So it kind of, it kind of helped there as well.
It's fair. Yeah, yeah. Flipping it to a positive. I like that. You mentioned that 2005 Hopkins team and, the fact that you guys kind of got beat up by them. But when I'm looking at your schedule, whether it be, at Fairfield, pretty much all at Fairfield, where I'm going through the year by year schedule, I mean, you guys took on some pretty tough teams and there wasn't maybe one game, maybe there's one where you guys, the score gap was 5 or 6 there and you lost. Oftentimes you're beating top ranked teams over at Fairfield. I'm just interested how you got your team to play up for those games. Cause again, the normal kind of look at those is when you're playing number 6, number 7 here in a schedule, maybe one of those games is a little bit lopsided, but throughout your years at Fairfield, you were always competitive, if not, beating those top ranked teams. I'm just wondering what the mental mindset was when you go into, a Notre Dame at number 3 or Ohio State that you guys ended up beating a couple years. But I'm just interested, man, because you don't see that a lot here where you got a mid-major that's kind of going in and beating the big boys consistently.
Yeah, no, that's nice of you. So I did 11 years at Fairfield. The first 8 years, I really think that's kind of really what you're speaking to. I think we did a really good job. I think we, as you mentioned, I think always had like a top 20 win. I think we had a handful of top 5, top 10 wins. In terms of kind of national relevance, I think we were, looked at really favorably in the national spotlight. And I'm super proud of my time at Fairfield. Again, another place with awesome people, with great kids, with great families. To answer your question more specifically about, I guess how we played, maybe, at a level there where you're competing against ranked teams. I think it was daily habits. It was just kind of creating a belief system that we can do this, lacrosse is a team sport, right? Like it's not any individual. We all have to make personal sacrifices for what's best for the team. And assuming that we did that, we could take on a lot of the, a lot of the big boys that you're alluding to. Um, I'd be lying if I said we weren't fortunate with some really good goalies, right? I think we had like a 6, 7 year window there where we had some real talented goalies. Charlie Cipriano, who, I drafted to the WaterDogs when I was first kind of building that expansion roster, was a guy that comes to mind. I had him for the first 4 years. And I think when you're really strong in goal, you're naturally going to be in games late. So I think that kind of automatically comes with a little bit of confidence. But then, you have to practice some situational lacrosse too. So where you put yourself in a position where you're on the winning side of 1 goal games, which we obviously played in a lot. And it wasn't always perfect. I mean, you're kind of pointing out some of the great, but I remember, I think we had a season where we were 8-6 and our 6 losses were by a combined 6 goals. And,
Well, I mean, that's what stood out. I mean, the wins stand out, obviously, because they're wins, but even in the losses, they're all by 1 or 2 goals. Like, you're competitive in every single one of these top games. Did you treat these games differently at all? Like, you can say, hey, there's every game's the same, but then Notre Dame's rolling into town at number 3, or, again, a plethora of those top 5 or top 10 teams. Did you treat those games differently at all, or did you have to talk to the boys in a different way when those teams came into town?
I think probably yes. I think like the coach speak thing would be, all games are created equal and we're going to have the same preparation for every opponent. But I think naturally human nature would maybe tell you otherwise, that when you had the opportunity to play against Denver out at Denver, who was the #1 team in the country, and it was like their spring fling weekend, like I think the narrative probably shifted there a little bit, right? Like just it's hard enough for a place, again, not like Fairfield, but it's hard enough to get a top 5 team on your schedule on any given year, right? So when those opportunities actually present themselves, you really want to make sure you're putting your best foot forward and you're trying to take full advantage.
Yeah, I just love the way you guys competed, because you see sometimes that moment can be too big for a team. And honestly, just looking at the schedule, it never was. So really kudos on that. We kind of glossed over the Maryland stint that you had. Let me know anything you took away from being assistant over at Maryland in those 2 years before you made the move to Fairfield, and we can kind of dive into that stuff as well.
Yeah, well, I got to coach Joe Walters. I got to coach Billy McGlone. I actually was just texting with Xander and Max Ritz yesterday, who were 2 former players. So those are some of the players that come to mind. But honestly, Dave Cottle, you can argue that he's on the Mount Rushmore of all-time greats. He's now involved in the WaterDogs with the PLL, which is a pretty cool kind of full circle moment for me. But I think my first game at Marist, we actually beat Butler, and we played them at the St. Paul School in Baltimore. And I think Dave Cottle went to the game just to kind of be supportive and to watch and to kind of see what these Marist guys were all about. And then he was nice enough to reach out when he had an assistant opening, and I went down and interviewed, and really just I liked everything about the place. I mean, at the time they were in the ACC, now obviously in the Big Ten, but College Park is big time athletics. And I guess a couple takeaways were, it wasn't just like a really high profile lacrosse program within the athletic department. It was a really high profile athletic department. So like in every respective coach, you're getting like some of the best coaches in their respective sport at Maryland. So some of that, you just get to know, again, other like elite coaches in their fields. And I thought there was some real just professional development that took place through that. And then obviously Dave Cottle is regarded as one of the best like X's and O's guys out there. So, while my title, I guess, was offensive coordinator and recruiting coordinator, I learned so much more about riding and clearing and the face-off game plan and special teams and the substitution game and that stuff that I probably, wasn't great at, if I'm just looking at my time objectively from Marist. Marist was more culture. Maryland was like, all right, let's become like an elite tactician. How do you look at things really strategically, and how does that ultimately kind of give your team a little bit of an edge?
Yeah, I had Jesse Bernhardt actually on the show last week, and we had a great conversation. You could see that that level of tactician is still there when it comes to just getting great at the techniques and kind of understanding the small parts of the game. I'm interested because, again, having this conversation on, I guess, player development with Jesse, it was a lot of cross sport talk. He was a football player. His brother was a great football player, and I'm kind of fascinated with what we can take from other sports. So you just mentioned there, you were talking to some head coaches potentially at, the basketball programs or the football programs. Is there anything kind of off the field or from the coaching perspective that we can take from, these other sports, or that you took from those other coaches in your time specifically?
I mean, I remember we used to go to, it was Gary Williams, and then Brenda Fries was the women's coach. We used to go to their practices all the time. I think how the basketball folks teach pick play, just two-man. It is like a whole different level from how I thought it should be taught, just in terms of optionality and reads, and both offensively and defensively. Like when you staying on your matchup versus switching your matchup, and what are some of the other considerations there? So I thought that was really interesting. Um, Kind of the free flowing nature of soccer. Like I really liked watching the Maryland guys play soccer. They were awesome. And honestly, I think I mentioned to you kind of before we started recording this that we got 3 kids at home. We got a 9-year-old, a 7-year-old, and an almost 5-year-old. So our evenings turn into youth sports. And honestly, even when I'm watching my 9-year-old at her soccer practice, like I watch as a dad just to like make sure she's having fun and working hard and being respectful and being a teammate and all that kind of good stuff that you think a coach would say to their kid. But I also pick up drills in 9-year-old soccer that I'm like, oh my God, like that absolutely applies to lacrosse. So, again, I think it's humility, it's being a sponge, it's always trying to improve, or at least have like a willingness to improve, because this thing's always changing. But yeah.
Yeah, I was speaking to Tom Mariano, and we were talking about some practice drills that he runs because he throws them up on Instagram and these reels. And one of the ones that I really love, but I didn't put it together that it was a soccer drill, was what he calls a rondo, where there's 2 defenders in the middle, 4 offensive guys on the outside. They could be moving or static. And you see it in soccer all the time where they're kind of standing in around a circle and they're kind of passing it to each other with like 1 or 2 guys in the middle trying to steal the ball. And we've been doing that a ton in lacrosse. I've been loving it. But
It's literally it's like a small contained like tight quarter like keep away drill, but it's like that absolutely applies. And I follow all these like soccer Instagram handles right now with Messi and all that kind of stuff, and you see that all over the place. But it's just funny. I mean, hey, here's a little bit kind of an aside, but lacrosse was actually the last sport that I started playing. I didn't start playing until 8th grade. I played literally every other sport under the sun first. And I think one of the many things that I love about this sport is it's a hybrid of everything else. So the physicality of football, going behind the cage like hockey, like a pick and roll in basketball, there is so much kind of cross-pollination, if you will, that I actually think that lent itself to me, I guess improving quicker than maybe I otherwise would have with lacrosse. But you don't see that enough nowadays, right? Like they're going like full time into the lacrosse thing at the age of 6, and it's kind of like, like I'm old school. I want our kids to play everything. So.
yeah. What are you doing with your 9, 7, and 5-year-old as they kind of get older? I'm kind of speaking to specifically coaches that are parents, right? Or maybe just parents that aren't coaching and have a kid that likes lacrosse. What's I hate to even use the term optimal because it sounds like I'm setting them up for something that's not just having fun at that age. But you see a lot of players that are 8 years old and they're doing a tournament every week or something like that. Certainly there's probably some positives in there, but what is like something that you're going to do with your kids at these different successive ages?
I just mentioned that, so Kate actually played lacrosse down in North Carolina, and I played lacrosse at Bucknell. So, hopefully our kids got Mama Bear's genes. But right now we're doing the soccer, the basketball, the lacrosse. They play golf. We're going skiing. Like I want them to throw a dart and learn how to play horseshoes and cornhole and like pretty much everything. So, some of that is just kind of protecting their innocence just through allowing them access to whatever it is that they want to do. And then, I mentioned I'm a work in progress too, because you're a coach, you're naturally a competitive personality. You obviously want what's best for your kids, but sometimes I've really had to bite my tongue. They talk about like the car ride home after practice or game. And sometimes it's back to what I was saying as a 22-year-old Andy Copeland. Like sometimes you just need to slow down, process, make sure that you're a father first. And that, again, if your kid grows up and they have good manners and they say please and thank you to their coaches after games, and if they're a good teammate, and if they're not palms upping the official, and if they're working hard and they just kind of develop good practice habits where they're incrementally getting better and they feel like they're getting better, and that kind of creates a little bit of confidence in the process, then Kate and I are super happy as parents. Like this isn't about like, we don't have like an end game for our kid. Like this is, we like them to learn all the valuable lessons that youth sports can create.
Yeah, it's a tough world to be in right now because you almost feel like if you're not being more specific with a specific sport, that people that are gonna, lap you or kind of go by, and that's a tough place to be. But oftentimes, I love that answer because it is just the variety of sports helps them actually play lacrosse. It's very evident at the high school level when I get a kid at, eighth, ninth, 10th grade that has only maybe played one sport. Their understanding of kind of just space is tough, or how to move. And yeah, I really love that answer, coach.
And you know what? Like, one of the best things I heard or read or came across on Instagram was someone who was saying, like you want to push your kids just hard enough in youth sports when they're young, so that when they turn of the appropriate age, say that's 13, say that's 14, if they decide that they want to try to be great in a respective sport, that they're not too far behind.
Mhm.
It has to be their decision to kind of go from good to great. Like, I don't think that can be parent driven or coach driven. It ultimately has to come from that individual. And I actually thought that made a whole lot of sense. Push them just hard enough when they're young to kind of create all the foundational skills for them if they make that determination.
Yeah, that's a great soundbite. I want to flip this conversation more towards player development at the college level in your experience at Fairfield specifically, and in Marist, where you are going up to these big time blue chip programs and, oftentimes winning some big games. How did you think about finding guys that weren't necessarily the ones that are getting recruited by Notre Dame or by Duke or by Maryland, and taking those players, developing them to the point where you go out and beat those teams? I'm just interested in how you took players that weren't necessarily recruited at that blue chip level to go out and beat the big boys.
I think you had to be really purposeful in your recruiting, and you had to find guys that call it like maybe a little bit of an edge, maybe a little bit of a something to prove. One of our best players, his name is Sam Snow. We recruited him from Bainbridge Island out in like right off the coast of Seattle, Washington. And a total like flew under the radar, and you're kind of like watching him and watching his film. And I kind of get why he wasn't actively recruited by some of the big boys, but I'm looking at him like, this kid's two-handed. He has range. He has a really good first step, was a really good basketball player, had a lot of these intangibles. And then you talk to like his guidance counselor and his coach, and everybody said he's made of the right stuff, just like a five-star person. And those are the kind of kids that maybe you'd take a chance on, and they didn't always pan out the way that his personal career did. But in his career, he made us look really, really, really good. And this was a Sam thing, not a Coach Copeland thing. But that's maybe a little bit of a kind of microcosm of how we approached recruiting. And then the other part of it, you see it in the college game now, like having too many five-star recruits can also be a bad thing. then it's almost like you have kind of like an embarrassment of riches, and it's hard to keep everybody happy. And then what does that ultimately do to your culture? Um, so purposeful in your recruitment, I don't know that it's just about collecting talent. You really need to vet the families, and you really need to just vet them as people. And are they gonna lift you up both programmatically and culturally, or are they gonna kind of be an impediment to progress? With a lot of experience, you kind of seen guys on both sides, but that's at least what we were kind of looking for in theory.
Yeah, I want to pull a couple things from this. The first, I guess, what was that kind of trait or a couple traits that you said you could see why teams weren't recruiting Sam?
It's kind of like getting into Bitcoin early, right? Like we were talking about that before. Like you're placing a little bit of a bet. Sam wasn't a finished product. I didn't need or expect him to be a finished product. I just
So
like,
he's raw.
yeah,
Okay.
he was raw, but I really thought that there was some ability there. Assuming that he, kind of continued on the track that we thought he could continue on. Um, so yeah, I would say that I think sometimes college coaches maybe want a little bit more of a finished product than maybe a project, and you can't recruit like all projects, right? You need some guys that obviously could be potentially like plug and play if you had like a certain need or something like that to fill. But in Sam's case, had a modest high school career, had an exceptional college career, and he deserves all the credit in the world just because he really grew and developed, and I would say got about as close to his potential as anybody I coached at Fairfield.
Yeah, there's a recruiting piece that is interesting. I don't know if I want to dive too much down the conversation, but through these episodes, I've been able to talk with coaches, and it's very clear that a lot of coaches want their kid to be playing at the top level, potentially in high school, if possible. And you think about Sam back in those days, Seattle, not necessarily the hotbed that you think of when you think about a Long Island or Maryland. So I'm guessing some of that might have played into some of these coaching's recruiting as well. It's like he's not playing against top competition every day and things like that.
No, I think that's accurate. I mean, we see it just being Fairfield County, right? Like a lot of, and I'm not saying I agree with this just because we work at a private school right now, but a lot of these public school programs that have been real high profile for a long time right now, like things are just a little bit different. Like the private school thing has become, appealing for, I guess a lot of different reasons, but yeah, point is, there's some of this in our culture right now where it's kind of like a collection of talent seems to kind of like lift all ships. And I could argue that to a certain extent, but I could also totally argue the other side of it where, you can find a diamond in the rough who hasn't maybe chosen the traditional path, but still has a lot of those tools and the ability that you're ultimately looking for.
Yeah, this question wasn't on my question sheet here, Andy, but you bring up kind of bringing in a lot of stars together. And I think it's an interesting way to tie in your time with Mikey Sowers because, I'm not throwing any shade. The Duke coaches are 10 times, 100 times the coaches I am. But I remember even the commentators in the Duke game when Mikey was with Brennan, they would be like, it's tough to get these guys the offense just wasn't performing, even though you had a lot of stars there on the field, two of the best players in the nation. I'm interested in your thoughts on that kind of mashup with Brennan and Mikey, having coached Mikey. But how did you do that then at the PLL level, right? You got a ton of guys that were the stars, even at the highest level in college. How do you get the offense to work together and not have it kind of die in one player's stick or something like that?
Yeah, sure. I think some of it is role definition. I mean, you mentioned Michael and Brendan O'Neill. I mean, with the WaterDogs, I had Michael and Kieran McCardle. So we still had like a two-headed monster at attack with two dodging attackmen that were also both very underrated off-ball guys. But, so you could, whichever guy you thought had a more favorable matchup, like that's who you would obviously try to get the ball in their stick in a short clock situation or something like that. We also had Ryan Brown when we won the championship there. Ryan Brown is one of the best all-time shooters and off-ball players in the game. And that's back to kind of the role definition piece is we're not We're not asking Brownie to pick the ball up on the end line and dice up his defender and kind of like attack the cage that way. It was basically like Brownie's exceptional in these other categories. He's an exceptional picker. He's an exceptional stretch shooter. That obviously applies when you have a 2-point arc in the league. And just his IQ and the way he like saw and processed the game was at an extraordinarily high level. But yeah, again, it's more so about like kind of taking the pieces of the puzzle and putting the puzzle together than it is just collection of talent that just doesn't necessarily work.
Watching Ryan Brown during practice and talking to him and, just coaching him, obviously, what can you take away from how he got to where he was as a shooter? Or like, what is something that we can kind of take away from Ryan? Because there's only a few guys I remember watching where their technique was out of this world with how they would shoot. I'm just interested. I want to learn everything about how Ryan Brown kind of learned how to shoot.
Him when he was a Hopkins commit, and I think he was at Calvert Hall at a couple of these, like it might have been like the Baltimore Under Armour team, and I'm sitting there next to, I guess it was Coach Bobby Benson and, Coach Petro, and, he had kind of that shooting stroke way back then. So I think some of it is just natural talent and ability. I think obviously at Hopkins, they must have done a phenomenal job of just developing his IQ and the way he read defenses and read the game, and had a little bit of that like Steph Curry. Like he is always going to be open and he's always going to be able to get shots off, very, very, very quickly. His shooting stroke is real. Just being a part of him at practice, his accuracy, his quick release. To some coaches, like he may look a little bit unorthodox at times, kind of like a little bit of the Brendan O'Neill, right? Where
It is.
his stick like all the way down by his ankles. Like if I'm sitting here doing like a lesson with a 10-year-old, like I'm not sure that I'm leading with that, but it just worked for him. And yeah,
It's interesting that more people don't do it though. Like, is that something that is like stick technology where he's got maybe like more whip in his stick where he's able to get it all the way back there? Or like, you saw it up close and personal. I want everything I can about this shooting process with Ryan.
yeah, I'm not sure. Maybe it's the stick technology. I really think it's just Ryan Brown being Ryan Brown. But I mentioned I coached Joe Walters. Joe Walters reminds me a lot of kind of Mac O'Keefe, right? Like an elite lefty shooting stroke, has all the left-handed release points, but Brownie had all of those release points with both his right and his left hand, to the point where when he was with Team USA, I don't know if they had a lefty attackman. I think they played Brownie on the left side. And I think he might have been like the leading scorer of all the world games, and just combination of elite shooting stroke and elite IQ. I'm a huge fan of his.
Yeah. Why do you think that shooting stroke doesn't exist more in the game? Like, why don't we see more of it? Because you mentioned the only two that I do know, you brought up the other one, Brennan. Like when Brennan would shoot, he'd go all the way behind the head and release all the way through. Why do you think that shooting stroke isn't more prevalent in the game?
Yeah, I think it's about having a lot of different shooting strokes. I think maybe the argument against it is that maybe it takes a little bit to get out. So you need a little bit more time. I think maybe you use it kind of coming up the hash where you can kind of disguise it a little bit more so against the goalie. I don't know that I have the perfect answer there. But I can tell you it was unbelievable to watch. And I can tell you just like even with my high school guys, like when we do shooting drills, just very simple up the hash shooting, like we try to work on changing up all these release points to kind of mirror, is there a defenseman in front of you? Is there some traffic? How are we going to, maybe try to manipulate things to still get the ball to the cage, maybe with a little bit of a screen in there. But Brownie had every release point that any shooter could dream of having.
I was talking to a coach locally in the area, and he was coaching at Culver Academy. He's talking about how when they do shooting drills, it's always live with some other type of action. It's never kind of that settled, like, all right, Johnny passes A point A to point B, and then we shoot. It's like off some type of thing that they're going to do in the game, whether that be like a pick, and then he runs off of it, and then they're shooting. I'm interested how you broke a little bit down on how you're coaching your guys now in shooting drills. How do you approach shooting drills in your practices?
Yeah, I think, I mean, it's shooting. It could be really be any concept. We really start with a lot of just the individual development, and then it's a lot of just part of the whole. So it's two-man offense, and then it's three-man offense, and then it's something. Say you have a two-person crease. Like, what does that action really look like? So you always do that, and then hopefully we do a good job of kind of like explaining the why. Like, this is how this ultimately translates to the next phase of our offensive progression. But that's generally how it goes, and I agree with that assessment too. I don't know that you're out of just standing 10 yards away from the cage with your feet set and doing this big crow hop with this big massive wind up, and then you're letting one fly. Like, that's not really realistic in terms of translating to game day.
Yeah. One of the other guys I like to watch in college right now is Owen Hiltz when it comes to his shooting. Just how quick his release is really cool to just watch as a fan, but even more so as a coach. Who are some other offensive guys that you look at in the game right now where you just really love their game as we kind of go into 2026?
I mean, I love Jeff Teat. I mean, I was fortunate there in that draft. That was when Ben Rubior was the coach of the Atlas. And, he obviously left Coach Bressler with an awesome situation. But I think they had the first pick in the draft and the WaterDogs had the second pick of the draft. And, well, as fortunate as I am to have gotten to know and coach Sowers and win a championship with him, like, had Sowers went 1, and we would have taken Teat at 2, like, I feel like I would have been just as impressed with him as a player and competitor. And I mean, everybody compares him to Gretzky, and it's rightfully so. Like, he just makes it look so effortless, but kind of deep down, he's a killer too. And I kind of love that combination that he plays with of poise and composure, but also like he'll step on your throat when he needs to.
I love that. Let's get into a little bit of this WaterDogs and the kind of journey you took there, at least at the beginning, right? Because you guys came in, expansion program, and you're kind of in a unique position across all coaching. One of being a GM, I guess, at the professional level, but more so about like creating a team literally from scratch. Like, a lot of guys walk into a program, they've got guys there, they have to add. You're going in thinking, I got nobody, and we need to now start building a roster. And so I'm just interested in how you thought about that those first couple days into, drafting that first draft that you guys had and building this team. Like, what was the most important position? What did that big board look like? Take me into this.
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, look, I want to thank Paul and Mike. I mean, obviously trusting me with the responsibility of kind of building that first expansion team was awesome. I mean, I loved it. I had so much fun doing it. I spent so much time on it. My wife was, at times giving me the stink eye, but it was just awesome to be able to say you were a head coach and a GM at the professional level, coaching with and against like some of the best players in the world. That was an awesome experience. Now, back to the expansion draft, which is what you're referencing. So basically the original 6 teams got to protect 10 guys. So there were 60 players automatically that were off the board that I couldn't touch. So we were, I kind of had like my Excel spreadsheet with maybe who I thought would be protected kind of well in advance of the draft. I think maybe they had to announce their protected roster a couple weeks before the draft. And then it was really just a lot of time on the phone talking to, college coaches, and a lot of time talking on the phone with guys just to get like a real full understanding of what their professional lacrosse aspirations were. You have some of these guys that are full-time Wall Street guys and kind of their availability gets cut a little bit. So you just had to do a ton of due diligence. And then you just had to figure out who was a right fit for the locker room. And again, we got some guys that had maybe a little bit of an edge, or maybe were a little bit disappointed that they weren't on the protected roster. Kieran McCardle was one of those guys. He was unprotected. Kieran McCardle still is at like the top of his game right now, right? I mean, Ryan Conrad was unprotected. We had Ryan Trenner. I mean, Chris Sabia, Connor Kelly, who's still playing, was, I think, our first pick in that expansion draft. So, we certainly got some talent, but I'm also not surprised to see us in that first season kind of out in Utah. That was the bubble season, go 1-4. It's hard enough to kind of be an expansion team, but then to do it and not really be in like the rhythm of a real season, kind of shrink this whole thing down in 2.5 weeks where there isn't necessarily that familiarity and that time to gel. I'm not totally surprised by how that first season went. Uh, I think from year one to year two, when we traded for Ryan Brown, when we traded for Dylan Ward, when we traded for Eli Gobrecht, who's still on the team, and I think that was also when I guess kind of like the PLL kind of like absorbed the MLL. So then there was another draft there where we got Flosser and Liam Burns and Benny Randall. I think that really was kind of like the inflection point for the Dogs to really get us on like a championship path. But yeah, 3 years we won a championship, and I'm super proud of that. And beyond just winning the championship, like winning it with that group of guys was awesome, like super super gratifying.
Yeah, I've got a couple questions here. One, who was the first call you made when it came to trying to lock down this protected roster, right? The guy or the unprotected roster, I guess, of guys. Like, what position were you reaching out to first? Because I'm trying to really kind of get into the mind of someone like building a team. Is it we need to lock down this goalie position? We need a star attackman. We need that big midfielder or something like that. What were your thoughts on that as you guys went into having no one to having that unprotected roster?
Yeah, combination of versatility and maybe just like personal familiarity. I think I mentioned before, Charlie Cipriano. I picked him up in that expansion draft. He was my former goalie at Fairfield, played for the Denver Outlaws previously, had plenty of professional experience. I knew what he was all about and absolutely loved the kid. So we picked him up as a goalie that we kind of retained for a couple years. I think with our first pick, again, kind of back to what I said, the personal relationship. Like Connor Kelly grew up kind of in Fairfield County, so I knew him for a long time, knew his family for a long time. He obviously went on to the University of Maryland. He wore the prestigious #1 at Maryland. He had played both attack and midfield there. And just felt like he kind of checked all the boxes of what you'd be looking for in terms of like an offensive player at the professional level. So he was our first pick. But I'd take a combination of those two things. I think the versatility piece, I think absolutely still applies in the pro game. And then I think the other part, again, it's just human nature. It's Bill Tierney, who's there now, has real familiarity with some of these Denver guys that he's kind of brought into the WaterDogs, and it makes all the sense in the world. You just kind of like know what you're getting, and there's a much larger sample size to kind of, make sure that you're right in your decision making.
I want to jump back in between the lines here when it comes to having a practice at the PLL level and what needs to get done and what the guys already know, talent wise, as opposed to jumping into a youth practice or high school or what have you. You're coaching the best players. What was your practice philosophy kind of like over your career? And then as you kind of transitioned to the PLL, I'm just interested in how you like to run your practices.
Yeah, well, you would treat training camp a little bit different than you would just kind of like your week to week kind of pregame practice. Training camp, you obviously had decisions to make. You had to make cuts. You had to figure out who the active roster was kind of coming out of that for week one. So that was maybe a little bit more cumbersome. You make sure that you would lean into the guys to make sure that they're coming in shape and they are ready to rock, because it's awfully competitive there at the pro level. But guys were really impressive on that front. Kind of our week to week, kind of schedule. We would, again, it's like I told you before how often I would talk to a guy like Michael Sowers. Well, I kind of had my pool of 5-6 guys that I was talking to on the regular once we were in season, just again to kind of get feedback, to talk about the previous game, to kind of talk about our next opponent. What are you hearing out there? Again, it was, I think, appropriately collaborative, right? Like it's not like it was a democracy where we're like, everybody's voting on like what the lineup should be, week to week. Like that was kind of like the head coach's responsibility, just to provide that, vision and some of the decision making there. But I really wanted the guys to feel some ownership in what was going on. We had an identity as the WaterDogs. We wanted to win in between the arcs. We wanted to play super fast, almost on the verge of kind of being reckless at times, but we just you wanted to try to find ways to score outside of just the 6-on-6. You really wanted to hunt the 2-point ball, right? Like in transition, we had guys like Rylan Reese who could hammer the thing. When you had a man up, sometimes like I think the man up stats uh, might be a little bit skewed because most teams are trying to hunt the 2 ball. So you're kind of like looking for opportunities there. The 2-point thing was a huge difference maker and a huge momentum swing. So yeah, that's kind of how we rolled, but it was a combination of like, what's your identity? And then not overcooking it too. You really wanted to know who you were offensively and kind of keep things simple, have a general framework, have some simple terminology, kind of have a short clock piece, and then just like situationally as games got tight in the fourth quarter, you wanted to make sure that you were, if you had a couple goal lead and you're up 3 goals, right? Like kill the clock, roll the ball into the corner, kind of set up into your ride, try to just really slow things down so you can, and then the opposite of that is when are you trying to find, when are you going early so you can kind of get a 2-for-1, right? So yeah, that was a lot. I hope I answered your question there, but that's just some of the thought process that we took on.
Yeah, I like that you brought up kind of the pace of play. It's obviously different between college and the PLL with the way that the shot clock works there. How did you think about pace of play at Fairfield? Did you use that to your advantage when you were playing these other teams? Were you kind of like hey, we're going to slow this game down to a snail's pace and try to work this clock out and keep it close? Or were you trying to, you know, I guess trying to just sneak some like you were talking about in transition and things like that, but be intentional about it. Everybody wants to score a 4-on-3, but you kind of have to, be intentional if that's the way you guys are interested in playing pace wise. So just interested in your thoughts on pace at both PLL and, what your time at Fairfield.
Yeah, I've kind of coached both sides of it, and a lot of that is predicated on what the rules allow you to do. And I was in the college game kind of pre-shot clock, and then once the shot clock hit, we were in a couple different conferences. So I think there's a lot of different variables that you kind of have to factor in. I mean, it's bad coaching if you're athletically at a disadvantage, but you try to like turn the pace up, right? Like that's not going to work in your favor. So if you feel like athletically maybe you're a little bit disadvantaged, then maybe you try to slow the pace of the game down a little bit. You just try to like in the more time that you have the ball, the more frustrating it can be for your opponent's offense.
Was that intentional that you guys did that at Fairfield when you play a number 2 and number 3 in the nation, that you're going to, like what you're saying, hey, we need to hold on to this ball and use the whole time?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we never coached them like we're afraid to take chances or we're not going to be opportunistic if the right situation presents itself. But I think some of the conversations would be, look, if you can take an average shot, but it's really early on in the possession, let's not do that. Let's pull down that shot. Let's bleed the clock a little bit. Let's try to grind down their defense. Let's try to frustrate their offense a little bit. And then let's maybe play a little bit deeper into a possession for all the obvious reasons there. We were never doing like the fake shot, like miss the cage high so the officials would avoid kind of giving you the keep it in kind of stuff.
Timer. Oh man.
Yeah, we never got involved in that, but do I think that there was some strategy about shot selection and kind of how you're thinking through situations? For sure.
How's your offensive philosophy changed over the years? I'm interested kind of, again, in between the lines of getting into your mind as a coach. What were those like kind of principles that you relied on that you would teach your guys in player development as you had them?
Yeah, I like how offense has kind of morphed. Like you're not seeing teams run like deuces pop and deuces fade anymore, right? And just like running the alley and 2 passes and dodging on a diagonal and playing. Like some of those principles I think still apply, but kind of that level of offenses being like that scripted and robotic, I think just as a lacrosse community, we've kind of moved past that. This new age is a lot of positionless lacrosse. You need attackmen that can play in front of the cage. You need middies that are comfortable behind the cage. Again, I think it's really important to teach the variety of ways that there are to score a goal. I think sometimes coaches maybe get themselves into trouble by just working on 6-on-6 for 80% of the practice. And I bet you if you like charted all your team's goals kind of throughout the course of a season, I mean, maybe 40% of the goals come from 6-on-6. I mean, there's so much other stuff from like how you approach the substitution game to rebounds to quick hitters off the end line to transition to, like a face off, like a stay and play. Like, do you put the opposing team's face off in a little bit of a predicament by having them set a pick or by keeping them on the field? There's a lot of different stuff that you can do. I think in the college game, you probably can take all of that on. I think at least professionally or even at the high school level, maybe you have to kind of pick and choose again what your identity is going to be, what's really important to you. But yeah, that's at least how I think offense has changed. And then a big part of our job too is just really, it's a free flowing sport. So sometimes like we need to bite the whistle. We need to let kids and players kind of figure it out on their own. And they have to make their own decisions. And, they're also responsible for the decisions that they make, but kind of like empowering them to think the game, I think is another one of our coaching responsibilities.
Yeah, you brought up this kind of situational play, all of these things that fall outside of, just traditional 6-on-6. And I just want to kind of reference this real quick. How do you build that into your practices? How do you build those into drills that are effective so your boys understand that moment when it comes to a game, right? Is it watching film? Is it kind of really being like, hey, breaking this down and slowing the pace down and kind of just teaching and then having them run through it? How do you kind of build this stuff into your practice so that it can be performed?
Well, I think, I think I mentioned before in terms of just like offensive progression, it's individual development, then it's parts of the whole, and then it's kind of some more, kind of team-based 6-on-6 stuff. I think some of the drill stuff that you can do really accomplishes some of that. I mean, if it's a ground ball situation offensively, one of the biggest flaws I see high school programs make is you have one guy running to the ball to pick it up and the other 5 guys aren't really moving. They're not really like thinking 2 steps ahead. So that's one of the things we always encourage our guys to do is think 2 steps ahead. So as your teammate picks up the ball, if it's a contested ground ball, you have an outlet right there in his face. So it's ground ball right to the face mask, ball out of your stick, make a couple passes and attack the weak side. So that's kind of some of the stuff that we may talk about at practice. I mean, one of the drills we do, I think most teams probably do it. I call it 656, but it's a 6-on-6 at one end. And then I'll call out a defenseman's name. That defenseman has to leave the drill. He has to run to the middle of the field. He has to touch the faceoff dot and he has to get all the way back in. So one, defensively, it kind of forces, you can't be man-to-man focused. Like you got to get in. If you have to rotate, you have to rotate. You have to communicate through kind of some of that gray area stuff. And then offensively, by the time it takes that defenseman to run that little mini sprint, I mean, say what, it's 7, 8, 9, 10 seconds. So you got to kind of get into attack mode. You don't necessarily want to be a dodger in that situation. You want to let the ball do the work, but you want to try to dissect, the defense in a hurry. So again, if the defense plays it really well, then the offense needs to have some discipline. So fine, pull the ball out, live for another day, keep possession, then get into your offense. If either, you move the ball really well or the defense misses a rotation or something like that, then be opportunistic and go try to bang one. But a lot of that stuff we talk about, hey, and then while all that stuff going on, again, not to sound like a broken record, but I'm asking questions to guys all the time. Like, why'd you make that decision? What'd you see here? And again, for me, it's like a little bit of maybe a check and balance. But it's also like, is what I'm saying being heard? Is there something that's being missed in the communication from A to B? But yeah, that's just kind of how we roll and how we're constantly trying to move this thing forward.
Yeah, I love that you bring up kind of that constant feedback where you guys are having a conversation of, hey, why did you do something? I do that as well. And I try to have, guys that have been around the program longer. Like one of the things I would love is for them to kind of have a conversation with some of the younger guys. So I guess my question is, how do you coach your more experienced players to have that conversation with the younger guys? And then, a step 2 beyond that is, how do you coach your coordinators I'm in an interesting spot this year where it's going to be one of the first times I have a coordinator beneath me. I shouldn't say beneath me. It's an assistant defensive coordinator, but I want to get better at that. I don't want to just coach the players, and you've done that over your time as a head coach. So how do you develop those kind of most experienced players, and then how do you develop coordinators in your role?
Yeah, well, the most experienced players that you have now didn't start as the most experienced players. So I think it goes back, right, 2, 3, 4 years when kind of you first got your paws on them and you're trying to kind of build them up. I mean, we have a senior right now who I'm thinking about moving from midfield to attack. He's coming off an injury, but I have a relatively young offense around him. And I think as any coach, you kind of want certain players who are like, they're like the extension of a coaching staff, whether that's in the form of being, your offensive captain, or they're literally just like named a team captain and they're responsible for kind of like leading the team in stretches and setting the culture and making sure that you have music going pre-practice and all that kind of fun stuff. But um, I don't know that like I wave the magic wand or anything like that. I think I'm pretty kind of like selective in terms of who I trust to kind of be a little bit of a mouthpiece for me. And that comes with just, a lot of previous experience, a lot of previous reps, and then I got to make sure that what they're saying is both like coming across with real positivity, because you never want to kind of bring some of that like negativity in crunch time or in like tough situations. Uh, and then you just got to make sure that they're, kind of like competent in what they're saying, and that they have their teammates respect. So then their teammates aren't just like shushing them. They're actually like listening to what's being said. So I think maybe that's how I would answer the first part. And then, part two, when it comes to coordinators, I really learned this when I was an offensive coordinator for Dave Cottle. Like my first year there, he was not the easiest guy to work for. And I kind of loved it because I'd go to him, right? You're like a young assistant. You think like sometimes you're the smartest guy in the room. Like you have all these like great ideas, and he's looking at me like, look, we were doing this like 25 years ago. Like, what are you talking about? So, and like he would kind of poke holes in a lot of stuff that maybe I would say, or I would bring to him, but it kind of put me in a position to where I had to be super, super thoughtful and thorough about what I was presenting him, because I knew that I was going to get challenged, but I was going to get challenged in like a real healthy manner. And then I think once I kind of like earned my stripes and demonstrated my ability, then just like anything else, then he kind of gives you a little bit more leash, but that's earned. That wasn't given to me at all. And I think maybe having a little bit of a similar approach with your coordinators. Like you don't want to have your thumb on them too much to where they can't like be themselves. Like they need to kind of be genuine, and they need to be authentic, and they need to be comfortable coaching. I think you can kind of verify through some checks and balances that what they're doing is kind of what you want them to be doing. And then once you trust them implicitly, then I think you kind of give them autonomy. And whether it's good, bad, or they're making a great decision or they're making a mistake, it's just like it kind of comes with the territory, and that's growth.
Did those conversations with Coach Cottle happen at like a coaches meeting, or did you guys schedule 15 minutes before practice? I'm interested in like when to have those conversations with your coordinator, other than kind of the, again, back and forth that you would get a practice time or anything like that. When did those conversations happen for you with Coach Cottle?
Yeah, no, we would meet daily when we would just do some practice planning, or we would watch some film, or we'd be talking about our next opponent, or what do you think about this? And sometimes you're just kind of like spitballing, just like dudes in an office, like chopping it up a little bit.
Got it.
But yeah, I mean, still is like really, really, really smart in terms of how he looks at the game and what he values, uh, and kind of personnel rotations, like anything that you can think of. He would, he kind of knew what he wanted, and he was smart enough to kind of challenge you accordingly. But again, it certainly, I think, made me a better coach.
Yeah, you brought up the transition and substitution game as things you learned when you went from Marist to being an assistant at Maryland. What were some of those little tidbits that maybe you can still remember, kind of working your way around that part of the game and what you learned from that time?
I guess it kind of depends on your model, right? Like if you look at Albany's been playing two-way middies for a long time, so they naturally will just sub one less person. They'll play offense with four attackmen, and then two-way middies, and then that fourth attackman to the box, sub an LSM on, but the two-way middies are kind of staying and playing, and that's how they're trying to put you on your heels or at a little bit of a disadvantage by trapping some personnel. So some of it is just what is your overall philosophy and kind of model based off of, what you think you can do that's going to best position your team. Some of it is just like when you watch film as a team, like what kind of stuff do you highlight? I was never really a believer in doing hour-long film sessions. Like the ADD of these kids kicks in and all of a sudden you're losing them after 10 minutes, right? So say you go into a film session with 15, 20, like real bullet point things. You highlight a kid who sprinted off the field when his opponent was jogging and there was a little bit of a 10, 12-yard window there. And all of a sudden you kind of created, I call it bingo, but you created a bingo situation where it's a 6-on-5, albeit for, not that long, but maybe it turned into a goal, right? But I just think that kind of stuff where it's easy for mom and dad to kind of highlight the goal scorer, like, oh, little Johnny, had a hat trick today. But there's a lot of other small plays that went into the team scoring a goal. It's just making sure that, that culturally is a real focus of yours.
Yeah, I was talking to Paul Richards at Richmond, who's the defensive coordinator over there. He was saying he stats runouts, right? And I think that's to play on your point, it's like that's a part that actually helps you win the game that isn't necessarily on the box score. So really good stuff. Coach, I have one last personal offensive question. I've got a really great senior this year who has great vision. He has a great stick. He's got two hands, all that stuff, but he has trouble in some sense separating, right? If you have that pole on him, and it just has trouble separating to get his hands free or something like that. I watched CJ Kirst in the national championship game, and they ran a lot of picks here for CJ Kirst, and I think that got his hands free a lot and force matchup switches and all this stuff, and I loved it. I was like, man, this is it. This is the answer for this kid of how we should kind of approach this year. But how would you go about kind of creating offense for a player who has great vision, but maybe is having, trouble separating?
Yeah, is he a physical dodger or is he more just
He can get into you.
Yeah. I think some of it, like you kind of call it like a bounce step. Like if there's contact, right? Like you kind of like push in to get your defender on their heels and then you just push out. And we always talk about kind of bottom hand, putting your bottom hand in the back pocket just to make sure that you kind of limit some of that stick exposure. So I think some of that potentially could be helpful. I think pick setting is a very clear way to do it. I mean, I don't know if you know Joe Keegan, who's like, does all the stats for the PLL. He's a wonderful guy, but he always used to tease. I think like the hot mic kind of picked this up one time when the WaterDogs were playing the Atlas. And so we always, Danny Logan, I got a ton of respect for, arguably the best short stick D-midi in the game. So literally like when we set a pick, it would be like pick with whoever's not wearing number 91. Like we were always going to pick with the other short stick. Danny Logan wore number 91. We were always going to pick with the other short stick. So we could kind of try to get that switch with the lesser of their two short sticks in terms of, Danny Logan could cover an attackman. And it's like, he was as good as your number one defenseman.
How do you meld that into having your offense flow? Because that's a really interesting point. I wanted to talk with my offensive coach to be like, this is what we should do. But I also am cognizant, like, I don't want to ruin your flow by doing this. So I'm interested because, 91 could be at any point of the field. And how do you meld that into what you want to accomplish without throwing off the flow?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So, I mean, we had like a base offense that, again, you're playing offense in the PLL with, if you're lucky, 30 seconds, right? So you got to get going in a hurry. So you kind of have your base offense, some window dressing, some pattern, play a little bit, see what happens, be a lacrosse player. The pick stuff really only applied when we would take a shot and the ball would go out of bounds on the end line and we'd pick it up. Kind of our read was, all right, what matchup do we really want to attack? Is it the Kieran McCardle matchup or is it the Michael Sowers matchup? So that was kind of part one. And then part two is, all right, who do we want to set the pick on that matchup? Right? So
Got it.
that's kind of how,
So a dead ball.
it was a dead ball. Say you had somewhere between like 8 and 12 seconds on the shot clock. Like you got to go in a hurry. Those were kind of your two reads. And then, the other four guys would kind of fill some spots, or you'd have a little bit of action. But again, you were just relying on those guys to kind of make a play short clock. But those were some of the considerations. And then we had certain, like, I think guys can learn when they set picks. You really want to do a good job of trying to detach yourself from your defenseman. Like, you don't want to go in with your defenseman on your hip where he can steer you into the pick and blow the whole thing up. Like, so you need to little bit of a forearm shiver, kind of come in isolation, actually try to set a meaningful pick where you're either changing a matchup or you're giving your guy like a real distinct advantage.
Yeah. Coach, I got 2 minutes left with you. We're already over time. I've been getting really into the box game, and I love that we're talking about picking because I was fascinated in me watching box and be like, I think 90% of the goals come off of just pick action or some off-ball action where I'm so used to in the field game. It's all, you want to start your offense, it's a 1v1. You're trying to beat a guy where it's not necessarily that in the box game. Tell me a little bit about maybe like how you thought about off-ball picking. I love how deep we got into on-ball picking. Tell me a little bit about off-ball picking and how you see it.
It's just it's just like a philosophy where you need to be willing to do what's best for your teammate before you're willing to do what's best for you, right? Like a lot of guys that maybe are a little new to the sport, even if you're talking about cutting, right? And you want your guy, say you have a 2-person crease and you want your crease to cut. Guys that are inexperienced, both guys are going to cut to the ball because they think that's like the only option. If you can create a little bit of a different, unselfish mindset where maybe the first guy cuts opposite to try to like grab a defenseman, grab a couple defensemen with him, maybe that opens up a little bit of a seam or a vacuum for that secondary cut. All of a sudden, now you're thinking like a really unselfish offensive player who's adding value to the offense by just very simply grabbing a defenseman, pulling him away from the ball. I think the same thing applies with picking. Is you, like, first of all, why are you picking? I think you need to explain that. Like, some guys will just run to a certain spot and they'll like pick air, and they're not really accomplishing anything. So you really want to understand why you're setting a pick. You need to be okay, kind of like embracing some physicality. And then you need to be smart enough to kind of read and react how the defense played that situation too. Did you change a matchup? Did you not change your matchup? Did you pull away the slide guy? There's a lot of different ways to maybe read into that. But yeah, to be honest with you, you mentioned the indoor game. I mean, as like a quick aside, so the commissioner of the NLL, his name is Brett Frood. He's the greatest guy in the world. He's actually going to be one of my assistant coaches this year. His family just moved up to Connecticut. His son, Quinn Frood, is a Dartmouth commit. He's an elite player, but Brett's going to be on staff this spring, and I'm super fired up to work with him and just ask
Awesome.
all sorts of questions about the indoor game and kind of do's and don'ts and some of their various philosophies too. So I'm always trying to learn and improve and get better and look at things through various lenses. But this has been awesome. I really can't thank you enough for having me on.
The last question I have, first of all, I'm going to text you probably during the season to see what you gained from the NLL commissioner there. But my last question is favorite drill and why. I know we touched on the 656. If that's your favorite drill, we can end it here. But if you have a favorite drill and why, that would be awesome.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely do like the 656 one. I kind of mentioned the other one. I mean, I stole it from John Danowski, but it's called Scrappin', and it's kind of a 3-on-2 ground ball drill. Say maybe you put your 3 offensive players kind of the top of the crease. Say you put 2 defensive players, maybe right on like the goal line. You throw the ball out to a wing. The ball side defenseman has to contest the ground ball. Okay, so that's part of it. Now, the other 2 offensive players, this is really who the drill is designed for. The expectation is that they don't just stand where they're started right now. Like, one guy needs to get underneath the guy who's going to pick up the ground ball. The other guy needs to get over top. So you basically have 2 outlets on both sides of the guy who's under duress picking up the ground ball. So hopefully the guy's picking up a first-time ground ball under a little bit of pressure, but then hopefully he has two like teammates as options to his right and left. So it teaches kind of like picking the ball up cleanly, getting the ball out of your stick, off a ground ball play, and then attacking the cage in kind of a 3-on-2 where you have a numbers advantage.
That's interesting because you bring up, so like if the ground ball is going out potentially on the wing, what you're saying is you're making the offensive guys, or the constraint is we need to be an outlet on both sides. So is that second guy going below GLE? Because what you often see out of this drill is like the offensive coaches want their players above GLE, that 1 to 2 pass backside and kind of finish.
Yeah, I exactly what you said previous. I don't mind if they go below goal line extended. The bigger one is like you need to get to those 2 spots.
Okay.
Right? Too often times you see guys that they're just like looking at their teammate, like, is he going to pick up the ground ball? Is he not going to pick up the ground ball? And then they kind of react to whatever it is that happens. Like I need them to react as their teammates sprinting to pick up the ground ball to provide outlets. So then you bang the ball once, and then you can go ahead and you can kind of attack the cage and see if you can score. But it's a great drill. John Danowski calls it 3v2 scrapping. I'm sure you could kind of Google it. I'm sure it would come up. But it's one of those very underrated concepts that I don't think gets coached well or consistently enough. And I think it applies all over the field. So that's one of the things we certainly harp on.
I love that. All right, Coach Copeland, this has been an amazing discussion. It's been an honor having you. I definitely have to have you back, and I'm for sure going to ask you some more box questions throughout the spring as you get more knowledgeable on it. But I appreciate you again.
Yeah, right back at you. Thanks so much for having me.